We're looking at Japan and China in dangerous waters with the spiraling row over disputed islands between the two nations. With us to talk about it, Lucy Liu, she's the Paris correspondent for Phoenix TV. Jean-François Di Meglio of the Asia Center here in Paris. From Stanford University, Philip Lipsky, and from the Washington Public Relations firm DCI Group, GU is with us. Philip Lipsky was mentioning it just before the break. In the coming weeks, China is scheduled to experience a once-in-a-decade changing of the guard. The next generation tipped to take over the reins in the Communist Party. President Hu's heir apparent, Xi Jinping, scheduled to meet the U.S. Defense Secretary Leon Panetta Wednesday. Xi, who caused high anxiety, you might say, by disappearing from the public eye for 2 weeks. Philip Lipsky, that's domestic politics. Is there a relationship between all that's going on inside the high halls of power and what's going on inside out there in the open sea?
I think absolutely. The oldest trick in the book is when there are domestic problems, you focus on foreign issues or foreign conflicts. And I would not limit this to China. In Japan as well, we currently have leadership elections for both the ruling Democratic Party of Japan and the minority Liberal Democratic Party. And you also have the presidential elections coming up in the United States, where we've seen quite a bit of China bashing, frankly, from both presidential candidates. So, we're in a very sensitive moment right now in terms of domestic politics on all sides. And I think that's definitely fueling the tensions here.
To impress the powers that be, the state bureaucracy, it seems, in China also wants to show its zeal. That's the argument of International Crisis Group's Stephanie Kleine-Albrandt on the website of Foreign Policy. She writes that China's two largest maritime law enforcement agencies, which already compete with each other in the South China Sea for budget and clout, have now been further empowered to assert China's sovereignty in the East China Sea. GU, is this all coming at a time when perhaps everywhere inside the state apparatus in China, everybody wants to show that they're on the ball, they've got zeal, they've got gusto?
Yes, I think this is definitely a very vibrant time in Chinese domestic politics. And just like Western politicians, everybody sees opportunities in crisis. And people, on one hand, I think they want to show that they're up to their jobs. And also they, of course, different departments in the government, they're all trying to win more budget for next year. But I think fundamentally, a lot of these actions are probably fueled by the personnel in those departments themselves. Don't forget, they are just like ordinary Chinese. They, when it comes to Japan, it's a somewhat a sensitive spot. And
does it make it slightly worrying? Because if again everybody's showing their zeal, doesn't that raise the potential for there to be some mistake somewhere where things escalate?
Well, I think the government, their actions are probably a little more carefully calculated, because if you look at the entire Chinese political philosophy after the Cultural Revolution, it's built on pragmatism, and every now and then the nationalist sentiment will roll, but fundamentally, if you look at past dealings of the Chinese government on territorial dispute, it's been incredibly peaceful, I would have to say. Because if you think about Falklands, you think about all the different military actions the U.S. have taken, compared to China's international interests and its comprehensive national power, we cannot recall a major military conflict between China and its neighbors in recent history. But compared to other conflict that's still lingering in our mind and in the Middle East, so I would have to say I'm not really entirely worried about Chinese government initiate any bold actions, especially from the departmental level. And I think it is election politics. It is changing of the generations of leaders, and there's a lot of China bashing as Professor Lipsky said, and the Chinese government is after so many years of watching the U.S. election, they're taking it at a stride too. They know the candidates are going to use inflammatory rhetoric during the election, but after they're elected to government, they tend to be more pragmatic towards China, and they understand that, and they're trying to play the same kind of game in China too.
Let me put this to Jean-François Di Meglio. Xi Jinping, we call him the heir apparent because until he's there on the rostrum at the top of the podium, he is not the president of China. He's considered more somebody who is dovish. He's not considered a hawk. At this point in time, do you think there still might be jostling for power and those who perhaps are trying to rally a more hawkish stance on the part of Beijing?
I wouldn't say the major debate is about that. If there is any debate in the succession fight which is happening, I wouldn't say that is a major issue. I would rather say that is probably a consensus about where China is leaning towards in terms of its regional presence. I think if we look at this issue of the islands, if we look at the issues that China has been facing with its neighbors, there is probably no specific achievement per se to expect. There is probably no concrete outcome of this crisis. Which outcome should we have? Japan apologizing? No. China seizing the island? No. But gradually what we can see is a consensus in China about a growing role in the region. What China is definitely aiming at is
and beyond... And that's not part of the power struggle within
I wouldn't
in
say
Beijing.
so, because yes, China has a growing role in the world economy. China has still a limited role in global geopolitics, but it should play a bigger role, and it's easy to do, in the region. And I probably believe that this is where we are leaning towards. China is also testing in a year which is quite important, where the US can go in terms of supporting their traditional allies, in terms of asserting their own presence, because the debates in the US about China have been a lot about commerce. They have been a lot about, China bashing, as you said, but nothing in terms of the US presence in the region. And there's also a line in the US politics currently that, US probably should not overdo it in terms of asserting his presence in the region. And I think China is probably testing that line.
I think the China's previous policy of those issues, no matter in Eastern Sea or South Sea, used to be, the policy of putting the kind of ambiguity, we putting the arguments aside, we do the cooperation, exploitation, joint exploitation together for the resources. So I think for this moment, although there is no surprise for the successor issue, but for the government on this moment, there's Congress coming, there's a changing government in the next year, early next year. So they prefer, the the stability issue, the development issue, instead of, the arguing or even the violence or conflicts issue. On the contrary, for Japan...
But when you hear Philip Lipsky, for instance, in part one of our discussion, say, you can harness public opinion around issues where you rally around the flag. The question is, China's a different place than it was 10 years ago. How do you turn off the tap when you need to get people to calm down?
Even with a strong country as China is today, with the Chinese, Chinese policy before and now, I believe that they still prefer a kind of, develop in a stability politics instead of trying to see how much we can push the baseline. And but for Japan, I think it's another story. We've seen more than 20 prime ministers in 20 years, in the past 20 years, 6 prime ministers in 5 years. So it's with the coming elections, it's much easier and interesting to play the Chinese card, the nationalist card. It's not. I don't think it's an issue of Chinese government when they're facing the changes. Even they are kind of a strong country nowadays, especially with such a population. How could you try to control, which with the situation could be out of control?
Let's look at some remarks made by author and journalist Jonathan Fenby in the op-ed pages of Tuesday's International Herald Tribune. He argues that saber rattling will only get you so far these days inside of China. When faced with unexpected events with political characteristics, the reaction in Beijing is to batten down the hatches and hope the storm will pass. That may have worked in an earlier era, but in the context of today, it demonstrates once more how ill-adapted the bureaucracy is to rule an increasingly complex country with a global role. Ji Yu, if the authorities in Beijing are taking a sort of a benevolent eye towards the demonstrations, are they playing with fire?
I think every demonstration has its detrimental potentials, but we also have to look at recent demonstrations across the world. You know, we had riot in London just recently, and I believe France Paris has shared its misfortunes with people rioting, and I think overall it's like I said at the beginning, you see a lot of rational voices that's still affecting public opinions in China, and all the personal communications I have with my friends in China, they overwhelmingly they don't really agree with the violent protests. So I think the popularities of these protests are probably a little exaggerated because of the sheer population of China. When you think about hundreds of thousands of people going on the street, it may be a big deal in a European country or America, but in China that's probably just a fraction of the population. But I think that they're definitely expressing a popular sentiment, but I think we ought to give the Chinese people more credit these days for they're not Muslim fundamentalists. They're very pragmatic. They're well integrated into the world, and at the end of the day, I think the majority of Chinese people would see these things rationally.
A serene point of view there. The U.S. Defense Secretary, we just mentioned this before we leave. It's something that you touched on, Jean-François Dimegio. The Washington in a sort of having to play a balancing act. He's on a tour of the Far East, calling for cooler heads to prevail. He's also bound, though, by defense agreements with Tokyo. Now, on the Japanese leg of his trip, Leon Panetta found himself at a press conference having to insist, for instance, that a new missile defense radar installed in Japan was in no way directed towards Beijing, but rather to missiles pointing out of Pyongyang.
We have made these concerns very clear to the Chinese, that North Korea and the use of these ballistic missiles is a threat to our security. We've made that very clear. And we've also made clear that we will take steps to protect the United States and to protect our allies from that threat. And I will continue to make that point to the Chinese when I have the opportunity to meet with them.
Philip Lipsky, is the Obama administration playing it right so far?
I would say so. It's a sensitive balancing game, and from the United States perspective, it certainly wants to make it clear to Japan that the United States is willing to defend Japan, and the United States has publicly committed to coming to Japan's defense, even over the disputed islands. But on the other hand, the United States doesn't want to give Japan too much of a blank check, for example, to encourage Japan to escalate the conflict further. So it's a very classic alliance question. So the United States is playing a balancing act, not only vis-a-vis China, but also with Japan. But I think so far they've done a reasonably good job.
Philip Lipsky, again, that balance of power between China and Japan, as it evolves? How do you see Washington's policy evolving?
Well,
Sorry, I'll put it to Jean-François Di Meglio first.
Yes. Well, Washington is nevertheless, I totally agree with what Philip Lipsky said. Nevertheless, Washington is less and less present, or at least assertive in the region. And that definitely leaves a question open. And this question, which is still open, leaves room
less
for...
assertive, even though at the beginning of his mandate, Barack Obama said he would devote more time to China, to the Far East.
I think those words left quite some frustration in the region, because they were quite promising. And then we are left with a North Korean issue, which is basically not very far from where it was 4 years ago. Of course, you changed leader in North Korea. There were no threat as dire as used to be the case 3 years ago, but we have made no progress at all. And implicitly, what Panetta was saying is that China did not make any efforts towards North Korea and towards placating what can happen in North Korea.
Philip Lipsky?
Yeah, well, one thing to remember is that one of the major foreign policy initiatives of this administration currently is so-called air-sea battle, which is a realignment of U.S. military forces into the Pacific theater. And so the United States is very much focusing its efforts on the region and moving away from the previous focus on the Middle East towards East Asia. And certainly North Korea is an element of that, but the big elephant in the room is certainly the rise of China and how to manage that.
And we will definitely be getting back to the topic. Philip Lipsky, I want to thank you for joining us from Stanford University. I want to thank GU for being with us from Washington, Jean-François Di Meglio, and Lucy Liu for being with us here in Paris. And thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.